You've probably heard of something called the woke mind virus.
You have talked about this
Woke mind virus.
Yes.
in really apocalyptic terms.
Woke is clearly a
Cult. It's a mind virus.
But what does that mean even? Woke can be a tricky thing to define. I think that's because in practice, woke has just become a synonym for what we used to call being a social justice warrior 10 years ago. What's different about woke, though, and what makes the idea of a woke mind virus so interesting is how it's been framed as a disease, something that infects and spreads, hurting not just the afflicted individuals, but also whatever groups or society that they're part of. This pathologizing of what I think is, in the end, probably best described as just the habits and mores of a certain kind of progressive as a woke mind virus is interesting, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I believe that there is another kind of psychological affliction in our politics, one that we don't talk about, one that's much more insidious, a conservative mind virus.
No, in this entire meeting, you said thank you. You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition.
I heard it said once, I think in a stand-up bit that I just can't find. If you know where this is from, please let me know in the comments, that you can categorize conservatives by asking them what year they think it all went wrong. Obviously, that's a joke, but it points to something fundamental about the conservative ideology. A conservative in America around 1776, back then they might have used the word Tory, would be more likely to support maintaining ties with Britain and would certainly resent the violence and property destruction of the Patriots. A conservative in 1789 France might be interested in conserving the monarchy and the role of the Catholic Church in society. Today's conservatives aren't generally interested in those things at all, and relitigating issues like monarchy or the separation of church and state is generally confined to the extremist fringe of American politics, otherwise known as the personal friends and Twitter mutuals of Vice President J.D. Vance. But why is that? If you think about it, it's not entirely obvious why conservatives stopped supporting monarchy, or established churches for that matter. Or for more modern examples, it wasn't that long ago that conservatives were rallying against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Today, there's a new set of issues, and the cultural ones have been broadly lumped together as part of woke. And just to preempt what I know is coming in the comments already, of course it's true that the party that most clearly represents conservatives has not always been the Republican Party, and the two parties have not always been so ideologically polarized as they are today. But I digress. This just isn't a phenomenon that you'd expect from most other ideologies. You wouldn't expect to see a Marxist give up on historical materialism or for a small L liberal to start believing in the divine right of kings. Which leads us to the heart of the problem with conservatism, the essence of what makes a conservative mind virus so dangerous, which is the fact that conservatism is fundamentally not an ideology at all. It's a disposition. This doesn't mean that conservatives don't have opinions or morality or anything like that. This is just about concrete political principles. I want to talk about an essay called Why I Am Not a Conservative, written by a man named F.A. Hayek. Hayek was an economist and political philosopher, and today he's actually most associated with conservatives and libertarians. Because of that, it might be surprising to hear me cite his essay, since he's absolutely more conservative than me. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you know that I am liberal. But I think it's actually precisely because of his relative proximity to the conservative movement that he was able to so clearly identify and describe some of its flaws, kind of in the same way that George Orwell, a democratic socialist who fought with a communist militia in the Spanish Civil War, was able to make such effective critiques of Stalinism and authoritarianism in his work. So the first and probably most key objection that Hayek makes to conservatism is that because conservatism lacks its own clear ideological commitments, it, by nature, cannot offer an alternative of its own. FDR's liberalism was different than Thomas Jefferson's, but at the core of both of their liberalisms, you'd find some kind of ideological commitment to the idea of liberty.
Thomas Jefferson believed, as we believe, in man. He believed, as we believe, that men are capable of their own government, and that no king, no tyrant, no dictator can govern for them as well as they can govern for themselves.
A modern socialist is in all likelihood very unlike Marx, but they both believe in some form of worker control of the means of production. The people who called themselves conservatives in the past and the people who call themselves conservatives now have entirely different practical goals and are really only united by one thing, which is that they both possess, for one reason or another, a disposition against change. But of course, change is inevitable. So what happens to conservatism when things do change? Well, it shifts, or as Hayek put it, the position which can be rightly described as conservative at any time depends, therefore, on the direction of existing tendencies. This is critical to understand how the conservative movement can appear to totally flip on an issue in a relatively short period of time. Take free trade, for example. Free trade was a quintessential issue for Ronald Reagan. This was acceptable to the conservative disposition at the time as a reaction against what was thought to be a disadvantageous business environment and a sluggish economy. Today, in a post-NAFTA, post-normalization of trade relations with China world, it's no surprise that the conservative disposition was open to a protectionist like Donald Trump. Free trade became the direction of the existing tendency, and so something conservatives once liked now had the potential to be framed as a bad thing. Free trade was never a principle. There is no principle, just disposition, a nostalgic longing for the past or a romantic admiration for what has been. I personally believe that a better world is possible, and conservatives want to return to a better, idealized time. What's implicit in that for many, even if they won't admit it, is that our best days are already behind us. New and radical ideas become old and accepted, and as a generation of conservatives and their preferences age out of political relevance, a new cohort of conservative elites scramble to build a new intellectual scaffolding around the dispositions of the new base. This is what's happening now with groups like National Conservatives, Neo-Reactionaries, or Christian Nationalists. These groups are all trying in their own way to give the conservative movement in the age of Trump some intellectual credibility after the fact. But why bother? You might be wondering, why would they spend so much time and energy creating a facade of ideology for a movement that's fundamentally based around a disposition? After all, most Americans aren't ideological, period. This is for two reasons. The first is while average people, of course, both progressives and conservatives, aren't really ideological, their opinions are shaped in part by people who are. And the second is because ideology ultimately helps to guide policy. You won't find many average conservative voters at a NatCon conference in DC, but you will find a lot of mega donors, a lot of senators, and future vice presidents. People with positions of actual influence in politics need a framework to guide the actual decisions they make. The post hoc ideologies provided by conservative intellectuals are there to provide that in a way that they believe sufficiently aligns with the dispositions of the conservative base. Or as J.D. Vance put it, does a normal Ohio voter read Yoram Hazony and Mencius Moldbug? No. They're old people, they live their lives, they support their family, they want jobs. But do they agree with the broad thrust of where we think American public policy should go? Absolutely. You know, I find it difficult to explain this to people without sounding like I'm making things up, but Mencius Moldbug, also known as Curtis Yarvin, a man that J.D. Vance refers to with the word we, is a guy who thinks that America should be a hybrid corporation monarchy and has in the past suggested that it would be desirable for unproductive people to be placed in permanent solitary confinement virtual reality chambers. Feel free to Google that on your own time. But anyway, that's why ideology is important. It guides the decisions of many of the people who are actually making policy and influencing public opinion. A conservative disposition on its own just cannot do this. William F. Buckley, founder of the Conservative National Review, said that, and I'll try and do this in my best William F. Buckley voice, a conservative is someone who stands athwart history yelling, "Stop."
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
And that may be true, but Buckley himself did much more than just yell stop. He had to. Someone who wants to seriously influence policy and lead has to have an alternative vision, has to be something other than the yeller of stop. This brings me to my next big problem with conservatism, which is its relationship to leaders and to authority. The way Hayek described it was by saying that, in general, it can probably be said that the conservative does not object to coercion or arbitrary power, so long as it is used for what he regards as the right purposes. He believes that if government is in the hands of decent men, it ought not to be too much restricted by rigid rules. Since he is essentially opportunist and lacks principles, His main hope must be that the wise and good will rule, not merely by example as we all must wish, but by authority given to them and enforced by them. I mean, is this not exactly what we see with Donald Trump? His administration, and in good measure, the entire Republican Party since Nixon, has been working to expand executive power. Check out my previous videos for more in-depth information about that. For as much as today's popular Republican politicians love to bash neoconservatism, at its core, what Project 2025 is proposing is a massive expansion of executive power in exactly the same tradition as what the conservative movement has been advocating for since Nixon. The entire thing, all of Project 2025, is predicated on an incredibly broad interpretation of the unitary executive theory. The idea, just like it's been for 50 years, is to strip more power away from Congress and from the courts, consolidate it within the White House, and then use this power to do as much policy work as possible from within the executive branch to promote the conservative agenda. One of the classic ways a republic can fall is to a demagogue who aggressively centralizes power. I look at history, at all the governments that have fallen this way, and I feel uneasy about that kind of movement. By now, if you're a conservative American, or if you've actually read Hayek's essay before and you've made it to this point in the video, first, I commend you because I haven't been very nice to you. But second, you're probably thinking something along the lines of the following. Conservatives in the United States are conservative for the fundamental characteristics of the country, which includes things like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the ideals of liberty even, which brings me to the real reason that I decided to make this video. It's true, Hayek points out that what in Europe was called liberalism was here the common tradition on which the American polity had been built. Thus, the defender of American tradition was a liberal in the European sense, meaning that in the United States, conservatives, or at least elite ideological conservatives, did have an ideology, even if they did not realize it, and that ideology was liberalism. The founding documents they cite are products of early liberalism. The founders were ideologically liberal, even if they were to varying degrees against radicalism. The philosophers conservatives cited even, also in many cases liberals. But this was Hayek's next line. This already existing confusion was made worse by the recent attempt to transplant to America the European type of conservatism, which, being alien to the American tradition, has acquired a somewhat odd character. The common American liberal tradition is no longer guiding the people in charge of the Republican Party, and to a great degree, the conservative movement generally. You can see this in how they make jokes about dictatorship and ignoring the Constitution, or in their attempts to usurp power from Congress and their threats to ignore the Supreme Court, or even in their attempts to overturn elections. You can see it in the ideological influences of the conservative elite, which includes neo-reactionary freaks like Yarvin and Peter Thiel, Viktor Orban of Hungary, and European far-right parties like the AfD. Young people in the conservative movement, in my experience, are especially ideologically whacked out. Google this guy, read about him, and know that he is very popular among young Republican staffers. All of these new right philosophies being embraced by the conservative elite are, in addition to being just another framework for conservative elites, distinguish themselves by being absolutely antithetical to the ideas that this nation was founded on. If I were to identify one fundamentally conservative insight that I think is the most beneficial to society, I think it would be the idea of Chesterton's fence. It's the idea that you probably shouldn't remove a fence before you understand why it was there in the first place. The idea that you ought to understand why something exists before you eliminate it. I think America generally does not yet understand that this country's conservative party is ideologically captured by people who fundamentally do not believe in the idea of America. Conservatism is fundamentally a disposition, not an ideology, but it is led by people with an ideology. And those are the people that have what I'm calling the conservative mind virus, the strain of radical anti-enlightenment authority centralizing ideologies that has infected and spread among certain conservatives, from the techno-capitalists to the theocrats to the think tankers. I believe that there is a way out, a way to move forward with, as a country, a more reasonable conservative party that effectively represents a real constituency of people, a disposition that really does exist. But any way out has to involve modern conservatism's ideological leaders, people who are proud to admit how much they hate representative democracy being permanently discredited. Okay, so first, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. It really does help the video get shown to more people. Second, I want to say thank you so much to the Soy Pill YouTube channel. He was so kind so as to shout me out in his last video. If you're from his channel, if you're here watching because he shouted me out to you, welcome. I'm really happy to have you here. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end. I really appreciate it. That's all. Definitely go check out his channel. And again, thank you so much. Okay, see you next time.